Part 1. The Morning Before the Sky Changed. Nagasaki, August 1945. The morning began the way summer always does in Nagasaki, slow, heavy, and golden. The air shimmered like a mirage above the riverbanks, and from the hills came the ceaseless cry of cicadas, that endless pulse that seems to measure time differently, as if the world itself is breathing. The Tanaka family woke early, before the heat could settle into the walls. The sound of Aiko's sandals on the wooden floor echoed softly through the house. From the kitchen came the smell of miso and barley tea. Outside, the city was stirring, ordinary and unremarkable, yet every breath carried the invisible weight of a war everyone wanted to forget but could not escape. The Tanaka family. Hiroshi Tanaka had been a teacher once, before the war. He taught literature to secondary students, stories about honor and beauty, about the kind of courage that comes not from fighting, but from understanding. When the schools closed, he worked at the harbor, keeping records of shipments and supplies. He was quiet, polite, and tired, the kind of man who still bowed to strangers even when hope had long stopped bowing back. His wife, Aiko, was the heart of their small wooden house. She mended clothes, tended a garden that barely grew, and hid her fear behind small, efficient gestures, folding laundry, arranging flowers, counting rice grains twice to make them last. Their children were everything. Kenji, 8 years old, already serious, observant, too old for his age. And Yumi, 5, a spark of sunlight in human form, stubborn, curious, always talking to the doves that nested under their roof. They lived in a 2-room house near Urakami, a valley on the northern edge of the city. The walls were paper and cedar. The floor creaked like an old memory. There were still books on the shelves, contraband words, hidden under tatami mats, Basho's haiku, Western novels, even a few poems Hiroshi had written himself. Every evening, by the faint light of a single lamp, he read aloud to the children. Even as sirens wailed in the distance, his voice remained steady, a small act of rebellion against the noise of the world. August 8, 1945. Rumors drifted through Nagasaki like mist. They said Hiroshima was gone. A single bomb, some whispered, had destroyed everything: schools, hospitals, temples, all at once. Others laughed. Impossible. One bomb cannot do that. But no one laughed for long. By evening, the rumor had turned to silence. The newspapers said nothing. The officials said less. But everyone knew something had changed. At the market, rice was gone before noon. Mothers traded heirlooms for a handful of salt. Men carried buckets of water to fill barrels in case of another air raid. Still, there was routine, fragile, defiant routine. Aiko scrubbed the front steps. Kenji chased the cat through the alley. Yumi gathered morning glories and lined them up in the sun. Hiroshi walked home from the harbor that evening, his shirt damp with sweat and sea spray. He carried half a loaf of bread, a rare gift from a sailor friend. At the corner, he saw a boy his son's age trying to sell broken pencils. He bought one not because he needed it, but because he missed the feeling of writing things that weren't lists of supplies. That night, rain came with the darkness, a brief storm that rattled the shutters and left the air cool for a few precious hours. From their porch, Hiroshi and Aiko watched the raindrops chase one another down the lanterns. He said softly, "If this ends soon, I'll go back to teaching. Maybe even teach English again." Aiko smiled faintly. "Do you think there will be students left to teach?" He looked out at the valley, the flicker of distant lights under low clouds. There are always students, even when they don't know they're learning. Kenji lay awake, listening. He didn't understand much of what adults said these days, but he felt it. The waiting, the tension, like a bowstring drawn too tight. He whispered into the darkness, "Father, will the war come here?" After a long silence, Hiroshi answered, "Everywhere is here now, Kenji." Outside, the river hummed with frogs. Inside, Yumi dreamed of birds. August 9th, 1945, morning. The sun rose thick and white over the hills. It was the kind of heat that makes even shadows tired. At the harbor, men worked in silence. In the streets, soldiers barked orders no one listened to. Aiko tied her hair up with a strip of faded cloth and sent Kenji to fetch water. He ran barefoot through the street, the wooden bucket bouncing against his knee. The air smelled faintly of sulfur and iron, the same smell that came after distant bombings. Yumi followed him, clutching her paper windmill. "Kenji, look. It's spinning faster today." He smiled. "That's because the wind knows it's almost lunchtime." She laughed, and he thought if the world ended tomorrow, he would still remember that sound. At 10 a.m., the family sat down to eat. Rice with barley, a small piece of pickled radish. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pretend everything was normal. Outside, church bells echoed faintly from Urakami Cathedral. No one knew those bells would never ring again. The sky before. At 10:58 a.m., a single plane appeared in the distance. Silver, small, almost beautiful. It glided silently above the bay, sunlight flashing off its wings. Children stopped to point. Some men waved. No one ran for shelter. The sirens had cried wolf too many times. Yumi was in the yard, still playing with her windmill. She held it up to the sun. Hiroshi, standing on the porch, shaded his eyes. "Inside, Yumi," he said. "Too bright out there." She turned, smiling, "But Papa, it looks like." The world turned white. 11:02 a.m. There was no explosion, not at first. Just a blinding flash, pure and endless, swallowing everything. For a heartbeat, the city vanished. Then came the roar, not sound, but force. Walls crumpled like paper. Trees turned to ash. The river boiled. And then silence. A silence so deep it felt sacred, as if the earth itself had forgotten how to breathe. After the light, when Hiroshi awoke, he was buried beneath what had been their house. He couldn't hear, couldn't see. The air was thick, the heat unbearable. He clawed through splinters until light broke through the cracks. Somewhere nearby, a faint voice. "Papa." He found Yumi half-covered by debris, clutching her windmill, its paper edges scorched. She looked up, dazed. It stopped spinning. He pressed her to his chest. "That's all right," he whispered. "We'll make a new one." He found Aiko next, bruised, bleeding, alive. And then Kenji, dazed but unbroken, carrying the family photograph that had somehow survived. Together they stumbled toward the river. Around them, the valley was gone, a landscape of glass and shadow. Where houses had stood, there were only outlines burned into stone. Where trees had grown, there were only stumps. And above it all, the sky still burned, not with clouds, but with dust and fire. Evening, the river. By dusk, the survivors gathered by the Urakami River. Men and women walked like sleepwalkers, their clothes torn to ribbons. Children clung to strangers. No one spoke. The river shimmered orange, reflecting the flames on the hills. Hiroshi tore his shirt to bandage Yumi's hand. Aiko cupped water in her palms and let it cool their lips. Kenji stared at the horizon. "Is it still Japan?" he asked softly. Hiroshi couldn't answer. The city was unrecognizable, a valley of shadows. The cathedral that once stood proud on the hill was gone, reduced to a single cross leaning against the rubble. The lanterns. That night, as darkness finally returned, Someone lit a paper lantern. Then another. One by one, they floated down the river, tiny islands of light drifting through the ruins. Aiko found a piece of charcoal and wrote on hers, "For those who cannot return. May the wind carry your names." Kenji watched it float away, its reflection trembling in the black water. For the first time since morning, Yumi spoke. "Papa, look." The lights came back. He nodded. "Yes," he whispered, "they always do." Above them, the stars emerged, faint and patient. And somewhere beyond the smoke, the sky, that same sky that had fallen, began to heal. The world had ended. But somehow, so had the fear. End of Part 1. The morning before the sky changed. Part 2. The River of Lanterns. Nagasaki, August 10th to 15th, 1945. The first night after the flash was longer than any night in memory. No one knew what time it was anymore. The clocks had melted, and even the stars looked strange through the smoke. Nagasaki was a valley of shadows, faintly glowing, the air so heavy with ash it tasted like metal on the tongue. The Tanaka family stayed by the river. It was the only thing that still moved, the only sound that seemed alive. Hundreds of people gathered there, not to drink, not even to wash, but simply to exist beside something that had survived. Hiroshi sat with Yumi in his arms, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. Every few minutes, she would whisper, "Papa, is it morning yet?" And every time, he answered the same, "Soon." But dawn didn't come that day, not the way dawn should. When the sky finally brightened, it was a sickly orange-gray, as if the sun itself had forgotten what color it was supposed to be. The second day, the smell came first, a sharp, chemical odor that seemed to cling to everything. Aiko tore strips from her sleeve and wet them in the river, pressing them over the children's faces. "Breathe through the cloth," she said slowly. Around them, the air shimmered with heat. The hills that had once been green were now colorless, and the wind carried bits of paper and leaves that weren't leaves anymore, black and fragile, like snow from another world. Kenji asked what had happened. Hiroshi wanted to tell him the truth, but there were no words for what they had seen. "A bomb," he said finally. "A very big one." Kenji frowned. "But bombs make holes, not this." Hiroshi looked at the sky. There was still a faint column rising in the distance, like smoke from an invisible fire. He thought about Hiroshima, about how people there must have seen the same thing only days before, and felt a quiet horror, the realization that they were part of something too large to understand. The walk. On the third morning, the family decided to move. The river was no longer safe, the water burned on contact, and the banks were filling with those who would never stand again. Hiroshi carried Yumi on his back. Aiko followed behind with what little they had, a tin bowl, a book of poems wrapped in cloth, and a small photograph of the children taken the year before the war. Kenji walked beside his mother, trying to look brave. They moved through streets that no longer had names. Where their neighbors' houses had been, there were only foundations, faint outlines burned into stone. A single shoe lay in the dust, its laces fused to the ground. The silence was unbearable, no birds, no dogs, no hum of the city. Only the wind and the slow crunch of their feet. At the temple. By midday, they reached what had once been a temple. The wooden beams were charred, but the bells still stood, half buried in the earth. Someone had tied a strip of white cloth to it, a makeshift prayer flag. Inside, a few survivors huddled in the shade. A nurse from the city hospital tended to burns using water from a cracked jar. She looked at the Tanakas and nodded. "Sit. Rest. You're lucky." Hiroshi didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow, like part of him had been burned away, leaving only duty. He helped the nurse gather wood for a fire. The flames crackled weakly, devouring scraps of broken furniture. Aiko found a piece of bamboo and carved small lines into it. One for each person she saw still breathing. When Kenji asked what she was doing, she said quietly, counting. Counting what? Hope. The Emperor's voice. On August 15th, a rumor spread through the valley. The Emperor was going to speak for the first time in history. No one knew how or when. A group of soldiers brought a radio, its casing cracked, antenna bent. They placed it on a broken crate and waited as the static faded in and out. The crowd gathered around like worshippers before an altar. At noon, a faint voice came through the crackle, soft, distant, almost human. It was difficult to understand, but the words carried weight. Endure the unendurable, bear the unbearable. Aiko covered her mouth. Hiroshi bowed his head. Kenji didn't understand at first. What's he saying? Hiroshi looked at him, eyes wet with something between sorrow and relief. He's saying the war is over. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if the entire valley had been holding its breath for years, people began to cry. Not loud, not joyous, just quiet sobs, like rain after drought. The nurse who had been tending to wounds sat down and wept into her hands. Aiko held Yumi close. Kenji watched his father, expecting him to smile, but Hiroshi only whispered, "So this is peace." The Night of Lanterns. That evening, people began lighting candles again. Someone found old paper, scraps from a burned ledger, a child's drawing, even bits of newspaper, and folded them into small boats. They lit them carefully and set them adrift on the river. Each carried a name, a prayer, or nothing at all. The current took them slowly, weaving gold across the dark water. Aiko's hands trembled as she wrote their family name. Tanaka, not to mourn, but to remind herself they still existed. Kenji asked if the lanterns would reach the sea. Yes, she said. And then maybe the stars. He thought for a while, then whispered, "Do you think people in Hiroshima see the same river?" Hiroshi placed a hand on his son's shoulder. All rivers meet, eventually. They watched in silence as the lights drifted away, one by one. The wind was warm, carrying the faint smell of ash and salt. For the first time since the explosion, the sky was clear enough to see the moon. The return home. The next morning, Hiroshi decided they would return to where their house had stood. He said it quietly, almost like an apology. Aiko didn't protest. There was nowhere else to go. The path back was longer than he remembered. Every step felt like walking through memory, each street corner familiar yet foreign, as if the city had been rearranged by someone who didn't understand its meaning. When they reached the hill, the cedar house was gone. Only the stone foundation remained, half covered in ash. In the middle of the ruins stood a single, twisted beam of wood, the porch post, somehow unburned. Yumi ran to it and wrapped her arms around it as if it were alive. "This is our house," she said. Aiko knelt beside her. "It was," she whispered. "And maybe it will be again." Hiroshi stood still, staring at the empty horizon. For the first time since the war began, he didn't know what tomorrow meant. A new morning. At dawn, the valley filled with mist. The light came gently this time, soft and pale, filtering through what remained of the trees. Birds, real birds, called faintly from somewhere in the distance. Aiko boiled water over a small fire. The smell of tea filled the air, thin but comforting. Kenji and Yumi sat beside each other, silent, watching the smoke twist upward. Hiroshi opened the small book he had saved, the one wrapped in cloth. It was Basho's poems. He read aloud, his voice quiet but sure. "Summer grasses. All that remains. Of warriors' dreams. No one spoke afterward. The wind carried the words across the ruins, blending with the hum of the waking city. Somewhere far away, a temple bell rang, not the old one, but a new one, small and bright. And for the first time since the flash, the Tanaka family smiled together. It was not joy, not yet, but it was something close. The war ended in silence, but in that silence, life began again. End of Part 2, The River of Lanterns. Part 3, The Garden That Grew from Ash. Nagasaki, autumn 1945. When summer finally broke, it didn't feel like a season anymore. The heat had softened, but the air still carried that faint, metallic scent, as though the wind itself remembered what had happened. In the mornings, a pale mist hung low over the city, and when the sun rose, it revealed a Nagasaki that no one truly recognized. The valley had changed. Where there had once been neat rows of wooden homes, there were now strange, uneven plains of rubble. The river that had carried their lanterns weeks ago ran slower now, its surface clouded with ash, but still it moved, always forward, always east, as if determined to reach the sea and tell the world what it had seen. And in a small corner of what used to be Urakami, the Tanaka family began to rebuild. The return to life. Their home no longer existed, but Hiroshi refused to let that be the end of their story. Each morning he rose before dawn, when the light was still blue and quiet, and cleared what little debris he could. He collected broken tiles, splintered beams, and shards of glass, not because they were useful, but because they were theirs. He built a new frame from scavenged wood. It was smaller than before, barely enough to hold 4 mats and a roof, but it stood. When he finished, he placed the old porch beam at its entrance, the one that had survived the blast. It was crooked now, blackened and cracked, but to the Tanakas it was sacred. Aiko filled a jar with rainwater and placed it beside the doorway as a blessing. Then, from a piece of cloth she had saved, she stitched a small curtain, not white, but the soft brown of unbleached fabric. It swayed gently in the wind, the first sign of home. The quiet work of survival. Each day followed a rhythm. At sunrise, Aiko walked to the relief center near the cathedral ruins. There, American and Japanese volunteers handed out rice, canned milk, and sometimes medicine. No one spoke much. Language was a bridge half built. But small gestures, a bow, a smile, a shared cup of water, became their new grammar. Kenji spent his days helping an old carpenter rebuild the neighborhood shrine. He liked the smell of sawdust and the sound of the hammer, the way it replaced the silence that had haunted him since August. At night, he came home with splinters in his hands and pride in his voice. Yumi collected seeds. She didn't know where most came from, the edges of burned gardens, the cracks in the pavement, the riverbanks, but she called them survivors. Every evening, she planted them carefully beside the ruins of their old fence. Aiko laughed at first. "Little one, nothing will grow there." Yumi shook her head. "Then I'll wait until it does." And so she watered her garden each day with a tin cup, humming softly as if the earth might listen. The American soldiers. By October, foreign voices had become part of the city's sound. Trucks rumbled through the streets, and men in unfamiliar uniforms passed out blankets and food. Children watched them with a mix of curiosity and fear. One afternoon, Hiroshi and Kenji met a young American soldier near the river. He couldn't have been older than 20. He handed them 2 cans of soup and bowed awkwardly. "Peace," he said in halting Japanese. "Peace now." Hiroshi hesitated, then returned the bow. It was a strange, quiet moment, the kind that doesn't make it into history books. 2 men, once enemies, standing in the ruins of the same city, unsure which one had survived what. Later, Hiroshi told Aiko, "He looked younger than my students used to be." She stirred their rice slowly and said, "Perhaps the world needed children to end a war made by adults." That night, Kenji wrote the word peace in the dust beside his mat and traced it with his finger until he fell asleep. Letters from nowhere. News arrived slowly, carried by rumor and wind. Some said Tokyo was rebuilding, others spoke of new cities rising from rubble. A man at the relief center brought word that Hiroshima, too, was trying to live again. Aiko began writing letters. To her sister in Kyoto, to a friend she hadn't seen since before the war. She didn't know if they'd ever be delivered, but writing made the world feel less small. Her letters were simple, accounts of the children, the weather, the small miracles of survival. She wrote, "We have seen the worst and found the world still turning. The mornings are quieter now. Sometimes that feels like mercy." She taught Yumi to fold paper cranes from the scraps she used to write on. By November, there were dozens hanging from a string above their doorway, swaying like white prayers in the wind. The garden. Then, one morning, Yumi's garden changed. Among the blackened soil, a small green sprout appeared, thin, trembling, but alive. She shouted for her family to come see. "It's growing," she said, eyes wide. Aiko knelt beside her. "What kind is it?" "I don't know," Yumi said proudly, "but it's brave." Each day after, another shoot appeared. Some wilted, some held on. By the end of the month, their yard, once a grave of dust, had small bursts of color, tiny white flowers, yellow weeds, a single red bloom that looked like it had stolen its pigment from the sunset. Hiroshi built a low wooden fence around it. "Let it be," he said. This is what the world wanted to remember. Neighbors began stopping by, leaving seeds, bits of wood, even a small wind chime. The Tanaka's garden became a gathering place, not just for flowers, but for memory. The first winter. Snow fell early that year. Soft, gentle flakes that covered the ruins in silence. For the first time since August, the city looked clean again, untouched, almost innocent. Hiroshi and Kenji built a small stove from an oil drum. They burned driftwood and scraps, warming their hands over the faint glow. Aiko sewed blankets from torn clothes, piecing together color where there had been none. At night, they sat around the fire and told stories, not of war, but of what came before. The fireworks at the harbor, the temple fairs, the sound of the trains before the sirens replaced them. Yumi asked, "Will the sky ever be blue again?" Hiroshi looked at her, the firelight flickering across his face. "It already is," he said. "You just have to look past the smoke." A new year. When January came, the city gathered near the rebuilt shrine to welcome the new year. There were no fireworks, no feast, only a small bell, a few lanterns, and people who had learned how to bow deeper than before. Hiroshi spoke softly to Aiko. "We are standing where the world began again," he said. She nodded, holding Yumi's hand. The child looked up at the sky, still pale, still endless, and whispered, "It's warmer now." Kenji placed one of Yumi's paper cranes at the shrine. It fluttered in the wind, then took flight, carried upward into the gray morning. And for a moment, even the broken city seemed to breathe again. The teacher returns. By spring, Hiroshi was teaching again. The school was only half a building now, no roof, no desks, just mats on the floor and chalk on a single surviving wall. But the children came, eager and quiet, their faces thin but their eyes bright. He taught them not arithmetic or grammar, but words like endurance and forgiveness. He told them stories from before the war of poets, travelers, dreamers. He reminded them that even language itself had survived, though scorched and trembling. One afternoon, as the sun slanted through the broken beams, he wrote 3 words on the wall. "Still we rise." Kenji, sitting near the front, whispered the words to himself. Yumi drew them later in the soil beside her flowers. The garden was large now, too wild to be contained. The neighbors called it the garden that grew from ash. The windmill. On a warm afternoon, nearly a year after the blast, Yumi found her old paper windmill in a box of charred things. The edges were blackened, the stick broken, but the colors, faint traces of red and yellow, remained. She smiled and brought it to her father. "Can you fix it?" He studied it carefully, then took a thin reed and replaced the stick. When the breeze came, the blades turned once slowly, hesitantly, then again, faster. Yumi laughed, the sound ringing like bells. "It's alive again." Hiroshi smiled. It never really stopped. The family stood together, watching the windmill spin under the soft spring sun. Behind them, the rebuilt city shimmered faintly in the distance, a patchwork of grief and grace, broken walls and blooming trees. And though they did not say it out loud, each of them felt it. The war had taken everything, but not this, not the quiet persistence of life. From ashes we learned the language of the wind. End of Part 3. The Garden That Grew from Ash. Part 4. The Bridge of Voices. Nagasaki, 1946 to 1950. The first spring after the war came quietly, as if the earth were afraid to make too much noise. The hills turned green again, cautious and thin, and the air began to smell of rain instead of ash. Every morning, fog rolled down into the valley like a slow tide, wrapping the ruins in softness. The people of Nagasaki moved carefully through this new world, still half afraid to trust it. Every sound, every bird call, every echo of footsteps felt like a reminder that they were alive when so many were not. In the small rebuilt house near Urakami, the Tanaka family lived between memory and beginning. The walls were thin and uneven, but they stood. The garden, Yumi's garden, had grown wild now, spilling out beyond the fence, flowers tangled with grass and small trees taking root where nothing had lived before. Some days, Hiroshi would stop teaching early and stand outside, watching the petals drift in the wind like small paper wings. He would think of the students he'd lost, the ones who never grew old enough to learn about peace, and whisper their names into the breeze. He had come to believe the wind carried things better than letters ever could. The letters that found them. In the summer of 1946, the mail came back to Nagasaki. Most letters were addressed to the dead. The postman delivered them anyway, laying them at doorsteps, shrines, even stones. One afternoon, Aiko received a letter from her sister in Kyoto. It had traveled for nearly a year through destroyed rail lines and broken offices before finding them. The paper was creased, the ink faded, but the words were alive. "We heard what happened. We prayed. We thought none could have survived. Yet here you are, and somehow so are we." Aiko read it over and over until the edges softened. She placed it inside a jar on the shelf, beside Basho's poems and Yumi's first drawing. That night, she wept quietly while everyone slept. Not from grief, but from the strange ache of being remembered. Kenji's journey. Kenji turned 10 that summer. He had grown tall and thin, his eyes older than his years. He followed his father to the school each day, helping carry books and charcoal. The new students looked different, smaller, quieter, but they laughed sometimes. Laughter sounded strange at first in a room that had once been silent for so long. Hiroshi taught lessons that had no place in the old textbooks. He taught that truth could survive even when buildings did not. That strength wasn't found in victory, but in rebuilding the things that matter after defeat. One morning, he asked the class to write one word on their slates, a word that meant hope to them. Kenji wrote bridge. When Hiroshi asked why, he said, because a bridge remembers both sides. The visitors. By 1947, foreign faces were no longer rare. American doctors, photographers, and aid workers came to study, to help, to record what had happened. Some brought food, some medicine, some only questions. One afternoon, a young woman named Sarah arrived at the school. She spoke slow, careful Japanese, and carried a camera around her neck. She asked Hiroshi if she could photograph his students for the future, she said. He agreed on one condition: do not take their sadness, only their light. She nodded, and her lens captured children smiling shyly, holding chalk like it was something holy. Before she left, she handed Hiroshi a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of the four of them, Hiroshi, Aiko, Kenji, and Yumi, standing in front of their crooked little house. Beneath it, she'd written, "The world will want to remember that life returned here." They kept it pinned to the wall until the paper began to fade. Yumi and the river. Yumi, now 6, spent her days by the river. She said the water sounded like voices if you listened long enough. Sometimes she would whisper to it, telling the river about her garden or about her dreams. One evening, she asked her mother, "Do you think the people who left in the lanterns ever stop floating?" Aiko smiled. "No, my love. They just find bigger seas." Yumi nodded solemnly. "Then maybe they see our flowers from above." She began folding new paper lanterns, not for mourning this time, but for wishing. Some said peace, others just had small drawings of birds or stars. Every full moon, she set them afloat with Kenji. They watched until the current carried them out of sight, the light flickering like the last breath of a dream. The bridge. In 1948, the city began to rebuild its bridges. The first one connected Yurikami to the harbor again, a simple wooden structure, but to the people it was sacred. Hiroshi took the family to see it on the day it opened. The mayor gave a speech about recovery and progress, but most of the crowd wasn't listening. They were just watching the reflection of the bridge in the river, solid, whole, peaceful. Yumi held Kenji's hand and whispered, "Look, the bridge has 2 skies, one above and one below." Kenji smiled. Maybe that's how the world looks when it forgives itself. That evening, when the lanterns floated again, some caught beneath the bridge and spun in place, tiny orbs of gold circling endlessly. Aiko said softly, "They're waiting for something." Hiroshi nodded. "For us to cross." The doctor. That winter, Hiroshi fell ill. His cough had worsened, not from cold, but from the dust and the air he'd breathed that day in August. A doctor at the new hospital said it was the same sickness many survivors had. Radiation, they called it, though few truly understood what it meant. He still went to teach when he could, his voice weaker, but his will steady. He told his students, "History will not remember our names, but it will remember what we rebuilt." One night, he sat outside, wrapped in a blanket. Kenji joined him, watching the stars. "Do you think people will ever forget the war?" the boy asked. "I hope they remember it," Hiroshi said. "But not the way it ended. The way we began again." When the breeze came, he added quietly, "Promise me, Kenji, build something that lasts longer than destruction." Kenji didn't answer. He just held his father's hand and listened to the wind. The letter from America. In 1949, a letter arrived, this time not from Kyoto, but from America. It was from Sarah, the photographer. She wrote that her pictures of Nagasaki had been shown in New York, in a small gallery filled with silence. People stood before the images of the children, the gardens, the lanterns, and cried. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "I think they are beginning to understand that the world didn't end here, it began again." Aiko read it aloud by candlelight. Hiroshi smiled faintly and whispered, "Then our little city has taught them something." He placed the letter beside the photograph on the wall. Together, they made a shrine of light and paper, proof that memory could be beautiful, not just painful. The Bridge of Voices. By 1950, Kenji had become the one to read stories at night. Hiroshi's cough had left his voice thin, but his son had inherited the rhythm of his speech, calm, deliberate, like ripples spreading across water. One evening, Kenji read from his father's old poetry book. A line lingered on his lips. The sound of one bell, across the river, across time. He looked up. His father was asleep, Yumi curled beside him, Aiko sewing by lamplight. The room glowed with the quiet hum of peace, not loud, not triumphant, but present. Outside, the rebuilt bridge gleamed faintly under the moon. From it came the echo of laughter, footsteps, and distant music from a festival, small sounds that filled the silence left by war. Kenji stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cool night air. He listened, and for a moment, he could hear it, voices carried by the wind, the living, the gone, the future, all speaking softly together. He whispered, "We built the bridge." The lesson. Weeks later, Hiroshi returned to the school one last time. He wrote 3 words on the new chalkboard. "Peace is work." Then he turned to his students and said, "It is easy to destroy. It is hard to build. But the hardest thing is to keep building, even when no one is watching." When he left that day, the children stood and bowed, not out of respect, but gratitude. They understood what he had taught them wasn't history, but how to live. That evening, as he sat by the river, the sound of a distant train drifted through the valley. It had been years since anyone heard that sound. He smiled, whispering, "The world is moving again." The garden in bloom. By spring, Yumi's garden had become famous across the district. People called it the Bridge Garden because it grew between ruin and rebirth. Tulips from foreign seeds, cherry blossoms planted by school children, wildflowers from every corner of the city. Every April, people gathered there for remembrance, not of war, but of endurance. Lanterns floated again, not for mourning, but for gratitude. Aiko said to Kenji, "The city breathes again." He nodded. "So do we." In the soft light of dusk, Yumi's old paper windmill still spun on its stick, catching the evening breeze. Its colors were faded now, but when the light hit it just right, you could still see a hint of gold and red, the colors of both fire and sunrise. We crossed the bridge not to forget, but to remember how to walk again. End of Part 4. The Bridge of Voices. Part 5. The Wind Remembers Us. Nagasaki, 1951 to 1965. Time in Nagasaki no longer moved in years, but in seasons. Each spring brought a little more color to the valley, each autumn a little more forgiveness. By the 1950s, the city was unrecognizable, not because it had changed too much, but because it had dared to change at all. Where there had once been ruins, there were now gardens and schools. Where ash had settled, children played. The sound of laughter had returned, shy at first, like a bird learning to sing again. The world had learned to breathe. In a small wooden house near the rebuilt Urakami River, the Tanaka family continued their quiet life. The garden outside was no longer a secret. People came from across the city to see it, to touch the flowers that had grown from burned soil. Some left in silence, some wept, and some simply stood for a long time, listening to the wind that always seemed to move gently there. It was said that when the wind passed through the garden, it carried voices, not ghosts, but memories. And maybe that was true. Kenji's path. By 1953, Kenji was 18. He walked each morning across the bridge his father had once shown him, the same bridge that connected the two halves of the valley. He carried books under his arm, heading to the same school where Hiroshi had taught. He had become a teacher too, not by duty, but by choice. He wanted to teach what his father had, not history as a list of wars, but history as a lesson in kindness. In his classroom, the walls were bright with sunlight. He told his students, the past doesn't disappear. It grows roots. What we plant in it decides what will bloom next. Sometimes he paused, looking out the window at the rebuilt skyline. The air still shimmered faintly, as if holding onto something the eye couldn't see. When the wind blew, it sounded almost like pages turning, the world reading itself forward. At night, Kenji returned home, tired but peaceful. His mother still kept the same jar of Basho's poems near the door. He would touch it softly every evening, a silent bow to memory. Aiko's stillness. Aiko had aged gently, though her hair had turned white before its time. Her hands, once busy with sewing and cleaning, moved slower now, but never stopped. Each morning, she tended the small altar by the window, not to pray for the dead, but to thank them for the silence they'd left behind. She had stopped fearing silence. To her, it was not emptiness, but space to think, to breathe, to listen. She often told Yumi, the quiet is how the world apologizes. And Yumi would nod, not quite understanding, but feeling the truth of it anyway. Yumi's flowers. By 1955, Yumi was 15. Her garden had become her life's work. She kept a notebook where she drew every plant she'd ever grown, naming each one after something she missed: mother's patience, Kenji's laugh, August sky. Foreign visitors sometimes came to see her flowers: soldiers, doctors, students, priests. Some took photographs. Others left seeds from their own countries, hoping they'd take root here too. A tulip from Holland. A rose from France. A wildflower from America. Yumi planted them all, saying softly, they came from the wind. One day, a woman brought her a seed from Hiroshima. It's from our peace garden, she said. Yumi held it like glass. Then it belongs here too. She planted it near the river, where the soil was soft. By summer, it had grown into a tall sunflower, bright and unwavering. When she showed it to her mother, Aiko smiled through tears. Your father would have called it a sun that doesn't burn. The last lesson. That autumn, Hiroshi's cough returned. He had hidden it for months, but Aiko knew. One evening, she found him sitting by the window, watching the lanterns drifting down the river. They're smaller this year, she said. He nodded. The pain is smaller too. He stayed silent for a long time before whispering, do you think they'll remember us? Aiko placed her hand on his. Only if we remember them. When he passed away that winter, the city's bells rang softly. His students lit lanterns and set them afloat, not as mourning, but as gratitude. Kenji carried one down to the river himself. He didn't write a name on it. He only wrote a line from his father's chalkboard. Peace is work. The lantern glowed gold against the dark current, spinning once before drifting away into the night. The years of growth. Time went on. New houses rose, trains ran again, and Nagasaki became a city of sound once more. People from across the world came to see the Peace Park, the rebuilt cathedral, and the statues that stood not in anger, but in reflection. Kenji married in 1958. His wife, Hannah, was also a teacher, gentle, sharp-eyed, with a calm voice that made even the loudest classroom quiet. They moved into the house beside Aiko's, their windows facing the garden. Every morning, Kenji walked his students past the garden gate. He would pause and say, "Everything you see here grew because someone believed it could." It became a saying in the neighborhood, repeated by children who didn't yet understand what it meant. But one day they would. The memorial. In 1960, the city built a memorial in the valley. It was simple, a curved bridge of stone with the names of those lost engraved along its spine. People came to read, to weep, to touch the cold surface and find their own reflection among the letters. When Yumi first visited, she brought a basket of flowers, lilies, roses, wild daisies. She arranged them at the foot of the bridge and whispered, "For those who taught us to grow." That evening, she and Kenji sat by the water, watching the lanterns drift beneath the arch. Some got caught on the stones, flickering faintly before continuing. "It's strange," she said. "They always find a way through." Kenji smiled. "That's what rivers do. That's what people do." Aiko's garden. By 1962, Aiko's health had weakened. She no longer tended the flowers herself, but she spent her afternoons in the garden, wrapped in a shawl, listening to Yumi hum. Sometimes, she would close her eyes and whisper names under her breath, people long gone, faces long blurred by memory. Kenji often found her asleep among the flowers, the wind moving gently through her hair. When she passed, it was spring. The garden bloomed brighter than it ever had before. The neighbors said the flowers opened early that year, as if the earth itself had wanted to welcome her home. The children of peace. By 1964, Kenji's classroom had doubled in size. The city had changed, electric lights, new trams, laughter echoing from cafes. Yet in every child's heart, a quiet thread of memory remained. One day, Kenji brought his students to the memorial bridge. He told them about the past, not with sorrow, but with gentleness. "This city," he said, "was once silent. But silence can teach you how to listen." A small boy asked, "Listen to what?" Kenji smiled. "To what the wind remembers." He stood there for a moment, feeling the breeze move through his hair, and thought of his father, his mother, the countless voices carried through time. The wind touched the bridge, the river, the garden, everything that had survived. Yumi's legacy. By 1965, Yumi had become known throughout Nagasaki as the gardener of memory. She tended not only her flowers, but others, the ones who could no longer do so. She walked through the valley each morning, planting small seeds where cracks had formed in the pavement, saying softly, "Grow here too." Her garden had expanded into a field now, filled with color, scarlet poppies, blue irises, white chrysanthemums. Children played among them, running through petals that rose like confetti into the sky. Sometimes, when the light was just right, the whole garden shimmered gold, and for a moment, it felt as if the air itself was remembering. The windmill. One summer afternoon, while cleaning the old storage chest, Yumi found her paper windmill again, faded, fragile, almost translucent. She brought it outside and placed it in the garden, near the sunflower that still grew every year. The wind caught it gently, and the blades began to turn, slow at first, then faster. The colors returned in motion, a blur of gold and red and white. Kenji, standing nearby, smiled. "It's still alive." Yumi nodded. "It's all still alive." They stood in silence as the wind moved through the flowers, the trees, the bridge, through every corner of the valley that had once been ash. It carried not sorrow, but remembrance, not of endings, but of everything that had endured. Epilogue: The wind remembers us. Years later, visitors would walk through the Peace Park, hearing the chime of distant bells and the laughter of school children. They would stop at the small plaque by the garden and read the inscription. This place began with a single family, a single flower, and the belief that even the wind remembers kindness. Sometimes, the breeze would move softly through the trees, as if agreeing. And in that wind, gentle, eternal, there was the faint echo of a child's laughter, the turning of a paper windmill, and the quiet voice of a teacher whispering, "Peace is work." From silence, we learn to listen. From ash, we learn to grow. From the wind, we learn to remember. Asterisk. End of Part 5. The Wind Remembers Us. Final chapter of The Sky Over Nagasaki, a family story.